We just got profit here, but top line revenue declined, and now our customer file is shrinking. If we don't right this ship, we have a real problem. Today, we're going to be talking about a premise that I call the shrinking sponge. The shrinking sponge is a phenomenon that occurs generally in businesses north of $50 million in revenue, where they have a large customer base that they can pull from, when they begin to focus on short-term profitability or adopt last click as their primary attribution model. First, I want to define what is a sponge. In this case, we're going to refer to a sponge as active customers. An active customer is a customer that has not exceeded the average time between their most recent purchase and when they would become a lapsed customer. So a lapsed customer is a customer who has not repurchased within the average time between purchases from amongst your customer sets. Everybody's time period for active customers is variable, but for the sake of active customers, for Sponge, we're referring to the idea of how many active customers do you have. And we're going to illustrate this on what I call a net active customer graph. Let's imagine for me, if you will, that we're going to use time on the x-axis, and then we're going to track net gain in this. Let's say this is just, let's use some easy numbers. Let's go up to the 1,000, and this would be minus 1,000. And then we're going to track a series of different views of customers. And we're going to use our neon here to illustrate the core thing that we care about. This is the number of active customers that exist. This is our sponge, our green sponge. The number of active customers growing for a business to represent the best predictive value for future revenue and profit for a business. Let's just say that this is to start at 200. There are 4 different kinds of interactions that we're going to track and measure. One is lapsed customers. These are customers that move beyond the average repeat purchase rate or repeat purchase timeline. Let's say it's the average time between purchases for your brand is 90 days. You might define a lapsed customer that anybody that exceeds that beyond 25%. So they get to 120 days, they haven't repurchased, they are defined as a lapsed customer. You as a business have a certain number of customers that move out of active state into a lapsed state. Oftentimes we think about our customer file as one homogeneous set of people, but that's definitely not the case. There are customers that are way more active than others. These are our lapsed customers. They represent the negative portion of what will be our net active customer formula. Then, secondarily, other things that we have for any given business is we also have what we'll refer to as reactivated customers. These are customers that they were in the lapsed section of your business, but now have moved back to an active status. Reactivated customers. That's category number 2. Category 3 is obviously our sponge. We'll put them in here. These are our active customers. Those are those for whom they are still within that repurchase window. This is our sponge, as we noted above. Sponge equals active customers. And then, of course, we have new customers. These are customers newly acquired in any time period. So they represent some portion of customers that you add. 4 categories of customers every month for you. New customers added to the file. Active customers continuing on. Reactivated customers moving from lapsed to reactivated. And customers that exceed that period into a lapsed state. So when I think about net active customers, this is the formula to determine whether your sponge is shrinking or growing. Net active customers equals active plus new plus reactivated minus lapsed. That's a net active customer formula. What I'm really interested in is this category here, the number of active customers. And in particular, if my activated customers exceeds my lapsed customers, that is going to be a signal. If this formula is greater than 0, you have sponge growth. If it's less than 0, you have sponge shrinkage. Let's just assume, for the sake of this month in February, that the sum of these is equal to 500. I would have 500 minus 500, or break even customer growth. Now, as we begin to plan for March, let's pretend that maybe my CAC in February was a little high. And now the directive comes down from the marketing team or maybe the finance team that we need to maximize profitability, or MER, marketing efficiency ratio, in March. Generally speaking, the way that you are going to drive profitability growth in the short term is to squeeze your sponge. It's going to be to stop the new customer acquisition and instead focus on maximizing the revenue from your existing customer base. And so March then begins to look something like this. Let's say we lapse another 500 customers. We're still somewhere in that minus 500 range. I would have the same size sponge because I was net zero the previous month. But now I'm going to pull back on my new customer acquisition. Let's say I moved all my media budget into retention or reactivation. Maybe I get some more out of my reactivated customers because I spent a bunch of money trying to go after them. Now my new customer stack portion of this is very small. I've pulled all my media dollars out of it. So now what I get is something closer to a minus 500 again on the lapsed customers, but I didn't reach 500 in the new activated. So now I have a negative churn month. I have, let's just call it for the sake of simplicity, minus 50. And I'm going to track this on a line graph here. I'm going to have a minus 50 on my net gain of customers. Sponge is shrinking. But here's where this becomes hard to see because this seems, oh, Taylor, that's obviously going to be a problem. But what I'm going to experience in the short term, especially for businesses with large customer files, where you can offset reducing your new customer acquisition for a very long period of time if you have a large customer file, is that your profitability in the month of March will exceed the profitability for the month of February. This is where the damage gets hidden. Short-term profitability will go up when you reduce the investment in new customer acquisition and squeeze the sponge on the active customers. But now we go forward and we know that our size of our active customers as we go forward is actually now going to be 50 customers smaller, a reduction of my active customer file by 50 customers. Now I have a shrinking sponge problem. This means that if I try and replicate the strategy from the previous month, which will likely be the directive because MER was great, profit was great in this month, I now have a smaller pool of active customers to try to maximize revenue from. How latent this problem shows up in your business is dependent on the size of your customer file. If you have a giant customer file, like many enterprise businesses or businesses in the 50 million plus do, they may be able to hide this for a very long time, for a year, potentially, certainly for months, because they will drive all the revenue gain that they need by focusing on their existing customers. Maybe they're having some success at reactivating some of these lapsed customers. But again, if I'm continuing to reduce focus on new customer acquisition, you can see the trend line of where this is headed. You have in real time what I call the shrinking sponge effect. And let's say again, if this is another minus 500 lapsed customers and I'm now down to, let's call it 325 or even 350 maybe in this month for this total sum of the positives, then moving along my line here, I'm going to be down to closer to minus 150. You can see this trend line of the overall net churn. So if this blue line here equals my net active customers in any given period, you can see I have break even, negative, negative. Let's say you come back in and you recognize this problem and you want to affect it. Why is it hard for organizations to make this change, to invert this process? The answer is because, let's say I go in April. Here comes, somebody with a clear view of this problem and they say, look, we just got profit here, but top line revenue declined when we tried to go back to back of squeezing the sponge. And now our customer file is shrinking. If we don't right this ship, we have a real problem. The tension is going to be that in these 2 months, MER, marketing efficiency ratio, is going to be really high. That's going to make your P&L look nice for a 30-day period, and you're going to be feeling great about things. And then what's going to happen is someone's going to come in, they're going to deploy this strategy. Let's say we're going to have slightly fewer lapsed customers because our overall customer file shrunk somewhat. Okay, and we're going to say, hey, we've got to offset this shrinking sponge. We've got to get to net positive churn here, but I've got a smaller active customer set. I'm going to replicate my reactivation, but now I'm going to go out and I'm going to make an investment in new customer acquisition. And I'm going to do this in an expensive fashion. And we're going to go out, we've got to refill the sponge. We need to get to net positive customer file growth. Why is this going to be looked upon potentially negatively? Why do you really have to educate the entirety of the organization through this change? Even though, let's just, for the sake of making this easy, say we were positive 100, so we were plus 100 in the customer file, and we've now inverted the shrinking sponge. In this month, MER is going to be much lower, and likely profit on a P&L basis is going to be lower. Why? Because the percentage of your revenue that was paid for is going to be much higher here than here. Because every new customer, let's just assume you're getting a really solid CAC. Let's say you're getting a 4-to-1. For every dollar that is earned here, you're paying 25 cents for it. Let's say this is 50% of total revenue, and you're paying 25% for half of your revenue. That's 12.5% of your total revenue. Over here, let's say that you were only paying for that same 4-to-1 ROAS for 10% of your revenue. Well, if 10% of your revenue is being paid for at 25%, that's only 2.5% of your total revenue. So you can see how the MER, the more paid customers you have, the higher that is, the lower your short-term profit. But the long-term, the future forecast, your ability to predict out future profit is going to be contingent on the growth of this active customer file. This trade, this inversion of the line is the critical investment that you have to make in order to keep pushing forward. And so the question brands always have to ask themselves to determine whether they should be growing the sponge or squeezing the sponge is this: in what window, meaning time, am I attempting to maximize profit? Because the argument is that if you are attempting growth, the key is the growth of this sponge. Now, you have to do that within the bounds of some level of profitability or cash flow management. But when you want to realize profit, you want to invert this back to less new customer acquisition, more realization of the value of the existing customers. Obviously, in an ideal scenario, if you could acquire new customers at a massive margin, then the effect on MER is going to be lower. But for most businesses, especially more mature Ecomm businesses, the cost of acquiring brand new customers is rather high. It may be net negative on first order, and so the process of acquiring new customers is very detrimental to short-term profit. So until a business can answer this question, it can't really determine this process. What I often see is a conflict between the expectations of the organization in the short term and the long term, and a lack of clarity of this exact principle. I'm not saying that net active customers should be the entirety of your targets, but it needs to be one of the things that you track, manage, and set targets around. And that I would be leery when you see this portion shrinking of your graph. That is the manifestation of the shrinking sponge. The number of active customers, those that you can depend on to repurchase when you launch a bigger initiative, when you introduce a new product, is reduced. Every month, to ensure the avoidance of the shrinking sponge, we have to have goals around not just MER, not just revenue and profitability, but also the view and health of our customer file. Sponge equals active customers, tracking these 4 categories of customers: net active, lapsed, reactivated, active, and new. And then the formula for net active is active plus new plus reactivated minus lapsed equals the net active. Greater than 0 sponge grows, smaller than 0 sponge shrinks. Will help ensure that you are protecting not just today's revenue, but your revenue long into the future.